Okay, looks like we have everyone. So welcome everyone again. I'm Chingy Chen. I'm faculty in the Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Bothell. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this talk and conversation with Brenda Cárdenas tonight as part of the University of Washington Bothell Labor Colloquium in conjunction with the Labor Stories During Pandemic Times class, as well as the From the Convergence Zones reading series. Before we get started, I'm going to ask everyone to please mute during the talk. If you forget to mute and have a lot of background noise, we may mute you directly. If you have any tech or access needs, please feel free to message Simon Wolf. And I think Simon's name right now is tech support or questions Simon Wolf. So maybe you can wave Simon to folks. There we go. Okay. And if you can't get a hold of Simon for any reason, you can also message me in the chat, not our guest speaker. This talk is going to be recorded and may be available at a later date in the UW Bothell Labor Colloquium and or MFA archives. And just to give you a little bit of heads up about how we're going to run the evening, after the talk, we're going to open up to a bit of conversation with the audience, which I'm going to moderate. And in order to ensure that multiple and diverse voices are heard and to streamline questions, we're going to ask you to please send any questions you have in a direct message to Simon for consideration during the event. And then I will curate the questions to pose to our speaker. And I may ask you if you want to ask them directly when we get there. And if you don't want to, then I can ask. And then if you have respectful comments and conversation, we encourage you to use the chat. And because of time constraints, we may not get to pose all the questions to our guests this evening, but our aim is to have a lively conversation. So it looks like we're zooming in from a lot of different places. This event is hosted by UW Bothell, which was built upon the unceded homeland of the Willow Sammamish people. Our campus also touches on the shared waters of tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. What this means for me as an educator and writer living in the region is I commit to learning about the history and culture of these communities and to show solidarity for the continued fight for Indigenous sovereignty and to work on decolonizing our educational practices, including whose histories, stories, and lineages we center in our writing practices and education. And I want to encourage everyone in attendance to do this alongside with me and to think about how you can make choices to support Indigenous communities where you live in material ways. I will say that it's a real treat to be with Brenda this evening because Brenda is my mentor from my PhD days. And a big part of my grounding for how I orient as an educator, as a writer. And I'm really excited that we get to spend some time together today. And so a lot of the writers and artists and thinkers that we've invited this quarter with us in the series, were invited with this question in mind. Whose voices do we not hear enough from? Who's not lifted up enough in our mainstream culture and society? And how can we collaborate to make more space to center those voices here as a community? And so, part of that is also naming our lineages. And so Brenda is a big part of my lineage and has been one of those important guides to me. So she's a hometown poet born and raised on Milwaukee's South Side, the granddaughter of Mexican immigrants and German working class people who at one time belonged to Wisconsin's Socialist Workers' Party. I don't want to steal too much of her fire because I know she's going to talk about her background and where she comes from, but I will say that she is a poet and person who has taught me and many others to love these working class stories of Milwaukee's people and also, other neighborhoods. I know you're going to talk about Chicago and also the histories of the natural elements around them. I will say shortly after I moved to Milwaukee, Scott Walker came into office as the governor and began dismantling union rights and other rights that were held dear in Wisconsin. That was over 10 years ago. I can't believe it. And I found myself busing to Madison with my peers and many other community members. And I was a new person in the program at that time, and I didn't know how, these actions would be taken, especially by faculty members. But Brenda was one of those faculty members who showed up, rode the buses, spoke out on campus and at public rallies, put her words in action and in service to what she believed in. And this left a really big impression on me, as the kind of teacher that I wanted to be, and also the kind of writer in terms of, thinking about how to be attentive to the world outside of the campus and also value those knowledges of those outside worlds. So without further ado, I want to pass the mic to our guest speaker tonight. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chen. Qingyi, what a beautiful introduction. I appreciate it. And I can only say that the learning that happened between Qingyi and I was mutual. And that, I think, is what is one of the wonderful things about teaching, is that you're always learning when you're teaching. Yeah, and we teach each other. So I'm coming to you from Milwaukee, gathering place of the waters, which is traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homelands along the southwest shores of Michigami. As Qingyi said, it's really important to me to honor the people and the land that I'm living on. I'm just going to begin with some background. As a third generation Mexican German American growing up in 1960s and 70s Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a city with a bar on every corner, plenty of bowling alleys, and the thick smell of brewery yeast in the air, mine was a world of lively fusions, juxtapositions, and cross-pollinations. English mixed not only with Spanish, but with the Purepecha words in my paternal grandfather's dialect and the Slovenian of a close uncle who had emigrated from Yugoslavia and married my Mexican aunt. My nuclear family lived above this uncle and aunt in a two-flat, and ironically, it was he rather than she who nicknamed me Cacahuate Mantequilla Princess Red Cheeks. Cacahuate Mantequilla means peanut butter, and they nicknamed me that because I was always sticking my finger in the peanut butter jar. My paternal grandparents had immigrated to Milwaukee from Michoacan and Jalisco, Mexico in the late 1920s and settled in a neighborhood of immigrants from various countries. In fact, my grandmother said that neighbors spoke so many different languages. When folks went to the butcher to buy meat, they would gesture to communicate what they wanted. A slap to the right thigh meant, "I'll take some leg of lamb, please." This grandfather initially worked in a non-union tannery where he suffered both xenophobia and perilous working conditions. So when he finally landed an assembly line job in a union shop, he was so grateful to be treated like a human being that he continued to walk picket lines with his union long after he retired. My maternal grandfather worked the blast furnace in a foundry. My father's second shift in a plant that manufactured mining equipment. One uncle stocked shelves at a grocery store, another drove a delivery truck, a third bartended, as did one of my brothers. The Slovenian uncle landed an apprenticeship to become an electrician, and a few cousins followed in his footsteps. My grandmother made tortillas that she sold by the dozen, my father wheeling them in his coaster wagon to her customers. Mother and aunts worked as store clerks, clerical staff, telephone operators, and bookkeepers. I recently inherited my aunts and uncle's two-flat where I lived as a child, and although I had no choice but to sell, donate, or junk many of their possessions, I just could not bring myself to touch my uncle's workshop or tool room where I spent many childhood hours. And so I'd like to interject for a moment here by reading a poem that speaks to that tool room. It's called "Close the Door, Don't Touch That." Even though it's nothing but a mess. Jars and coffee cans of screws, nails, bolts, nuts, O-rings, spools of wire in 6 different gauges, pliers, flatheads, wire cutters, Phillips, How many hammers, wrenches? How many light sockets, electrical housing years out of code? Hand saws dangle from pipes, bits of chain and twined loop crawl like leafy vines. A table saw blocks our path to the back of this pantry-thin basement room where the vice's jaws bite a slice of twisted metal. All dust and clutter, all manner of making or fixing out on the workbench, waiting for us to wind it alive like a music box, like an old phonograph with its trumpet flower mouth. A drill lies on the counter, expecting Uncle's hand, and I'm in a high chair, all eyes, dazzled and reaching for everything that sparkled, everything that could do something I had yet to imagine. For my paternal grandparents, brown immigrants with only third grade educations, making do demanded re-envisioning in order to retool, combine, and craft new items with whatever materials they could salvage from what they had broken or others were throwing away. They passed this creativity on to their children and grandchildren who made Christmas poinsettia wreaths out of scrapped computer punch cards, jewelry boxes out of empty cigar boxes, suits, skirts, and dresses out of the fabric store's discarded remnants, and for me, blank books out of office paper waste stitched together with yarn. Anything could be reimagined and remixed, find itself newly affixed to a strange surface, a practice that Chicanx study scholar Tomás Ibarra-Frausto has theorized as a rascuachismo, an underdog perspective or working class sensibility rooted in resourcefulness and adaptability that springs from making do with what is at hand. A sensibility attuned to mixtures and confluence, preferring communion over purity. Things that are rascuache possess an ephemeral quality, a sense of temporality and impermanence, here today, gone tomorrow. In the realm of taste and in art, to be rascuache is to be unfettered and unrestrained, to favor the elaborate over the simple, the flamboyant over the severe. Bright colors are preferred to somber, high intensity to low, the shimmering and sparkling to the muted and subdued. My family's was a practical rascuachismo, but the objects they made always bore an artistic flourish, emerged from a craftsperson's hand, an artist's eye. Perhaps this is one reason why, despite their humble backgrounds, two uncles, a brother, and several cousins became, in their spare time, visual artists and artisans, such as furniture makers, wood carvers, and leathersmiths. One who rode rodeo often intricately tooled his own chaps and saddles. They paid attention to detail, whether painting a coffee can to use as a planter or a large canvas that would hang above a mantle. This rascuache sensibility and love of art and artisanship, of the handmade, has never left me. This, along with the deep respect I have for poor and working class people's knowledge, skills, and resourcefulness, has had a profound influence on the ways I write about working class lives and labor struggles, as well as how I live now, the choices I make, despite becoming educated and finding my way into the middle class. For example, after earning my graduate degree in creative writing, rather than going on the academic job market, I chose to spend a number of years living and working in Chicago's Barrio Pilsen for a not-for-profit arts organization that served underprivileged youth. This was before the barrio became gentrified, when you could find a tailor, a shoemaker, and a tortilleria within steps of one another. When on Friday nights, neighbors gathered at the Hood's only coffee house with 12 packs of Modelo, swept up all the tables and chairs, hired a local conjunto, and danced all night. This was an immigrant and working class neighborhood where we bartered and traded. I translated my neighbor's social security documents, and he shared gardening secrets, tended my plants when I was away. It was a hood where gangbangers guarded my house because I taught and counseled their kids. This isn't to glorify a place and people who also suffered many hardships, low wages and long hours, unemployment, undocumented invisibility, drug addiction, teenage pregnancy, gang violence. A few of the teens I taught were gunned down a few blocks from our building, and I'll never forget the horror and the heartache of having to hand one's parents the mask he had casted of his face a few days before he died. But it is to say that the barrio was a tight-knit community where people pulled together to confront their hardships and work for change. The Resurrection Project, which built affordable Habitat for Humanity-like homes for residents, was one such agent of change. The youth programs of the National Museum of Mexican Art, where I worked, was another. We offered classes taught by local artists, such as mask making and storytelling, printmaking and poetry writing, spoken word and graphic design, in which students produced a CD of their own poems and designed the CD jackets. We also had a bilingual youth-operated radio station with a training program, one of the most incredible programs I've ever witnessed, let alone helped to design and run, for making youth voices heard, while also teaching them a boatload of technical skills. And there were many more examples of cultural work and political activism in the area at that time. In Pilsen's sister barrio, La Villita, or Little Village, activist friends went on an arduous hunger strike to demand that a school be built. So now I'd like to read a poem to you that remembers Chicago's Maxwell Street flea market. It was a flea market, which was located very close to Pilsen, and the blues musicians who often played there. The poem also commemorates them, while also mourning the gentrification that did away with Maxwell Street. I wrote the poem at the request of an artist friend who was at the time painting homages to many of the Delta blues musicians. And so this poem is called At the Base of the Blues Tree, Una Ofrenda for Jimmy Davis, Chicago blues man. And there might be a painting of the painting that my friend Roberto Valadez did called Arbol de Blues that might be coming up on the screen for you. The hands of this telling tree pull him from the cobalt bowl of sky, bring Jimmy back to the ruins of Maxwell Street hunched in dusk. He stood where strings intersected frets like tracks meeting ties on the Illinois Central's passage from the Mississippi Delta, then followed the breadcrumbs of troubadours to the steel city. 12-hour shifts beckoned Mexicanos north on the Union Pacific from Piedras Negras to Pilsen, back of the yards. How many grandparents, mothers, and fathers pounded steak into soil, snuck or were shoved into boxcars, leapt onto the train's iron rungs as it shuddered along the rails to foundries where they poured molten metal, faced hot licks of the blast furnaces growl and hiss. How many lugged themselves north to slaughterhouses that drooled rank puddles at their feet? This so sons and daughters might step off into another era, choose instruments of wood and metal, axes of their own timbre. This so Jimmy might mix his own palette, tune each turquoise pitch and purple tone into an electric blues old as corridos, but new to the Mexicanos who came each Sunday to the market at Maxwell. New to the ears of Roberto, a boy who would keep his ranchera rhythms close as a pair of old jeans, but grow into the blues as he listened to the airs of Papa Jackson, Johnny Young, Howlin' Wolf, Nighthawk, and Maxwell Jimmy. Now Roberto sits in overalls at an easel, splits the hairs of his brush over how to compose this ofrenda, this homage, how to take Jimmy back in time to the market whose merchants once hustled with tricks for trade ancient as Africa, as Toltec, Mexico, Maxwell, whose live blues bands and car radios belting norteño mixes made every Sunday a session. How to take Jimmy back to Maxwell's gathering spot, where he guzzles from an aluminum garden blooming atop his amp, swings his axe, fingers climbing its trunk, plucking twigs while our feet tap the roots of this wailing tree. Notes skip through alleys of his voice like gravel pinging off windshields. Lift a pitch high enough to singe the autumn sky, cousin to the red and green gritos of the barrio only blocks away. 12 bars spin like metal rims, stack like hubcaps, chords crackling in the tin barrels of his laughter. When people gather, he sputters, "What did the one-eyed woman say?" and waits for them to peer into the devil's draw of his eyes before he roars, "Where is my one-eyed man?" But we barely get to the punchline, to the end of a set before the mayor swings his axe, a claw that rips this arbo de blues up by its roots, before Chicago swings its wrecking ball to level homes, stores, restaurants, bars, before troops graffiti blast, scrub, and cinch sack it all, but one empty wall where someone has scrawled Jimmy's name among the others in this hall of fame, Willie, Hound Dog, Honey Boy, Sal, the many legends who've shared the marrow of their music, of Santana's hearty soup with the bones still in it, steaming with sabor and sometimes weeping. So although my choice to spend time living and working in this community meant that I began my current career teaching in a graduate program at a research university later in life, I would never skip the years in Pilsen. Just as I wouldn't change my upbringing, despite how much easier middle or upper class privilege might have made it. These experiences are imprinted indelibly in who I've become. I've had to laugh the few times I've commiserated with a colleague about how difficult I find it to keep up with teaching, writing, community work, and domestic chores. And that colleague has suggested I hire a maid. A maid? Are you kidding? I'm only a few steps away from being the maid myself. So when I write poems about my own upbringing, family, and culture, or about the social, political, and economic injustices faced by people of color and working class people in general, I aim first to uplift and celebrate these lives, to make apparent how much they have to teach all of us. I also tried to lay bare through specific images and stories the systemic and intersectional isms and phobias that conspire to push people to the pavement and keep them underfoot, to kill their will, if not their bodies. I work to underscore, sometimes through form, the complexities of such systems, such lives, while also using language my less formally educated family members could and would appreciate. At times, this means a bit of sarcastic humor. It always means keeping myself honest and accountable to the communities I bring into my poems. And often, the rascuache sensibility I spoke of earlier is present. When I collage others' voices into a poem or write in response to their art, the spirit of confluence and communion, of re-envisioning what is at hand, inspires and manifests itself in the poem. When I write interlingually, mixing Spanish and English, it doesn't only reflect the language I heard and spoke as a child, and in many communities where I've lived, worked, and or volunteered. It also asserts the transcultural and translingual nature of many communities in the United States as it rebukes the absurd notion of purity. I'd like now to read some poems that I hope illustrate some of what I've been saying. I'll begin with an interlingual poem titled Placa Roll Call, which responds in part to a work of graffiti art by the Los Angeles artist Chaz Bojorquez. And the poem begins with a quotation by the artist himself, who said, "If the city was a body, graffiti would tell us where it hurts." And this block would shout, "Nos diste un chingazo, cabrón. Mira esta cara rota, these baton cracked ribs, this black and blue streak dizzy con gente, Blades, Kiki, Larry, Snow, Enrique, Connie, Elton, King, David, Kelly, Jeff, Raton, Chaz. Los de aquí Los de abajo. This roll call won't be silenced, not by Glock, not by chokehold. This, our temple of runes, our tomb, its glyphic curve and flow, calligraphic code writ acrylic. This, our relic, our scroll unrolled in catacombs, our flecks of subtext still buzzing después de que vayamos con la pelona. Que lucha, loco. Ven, baile con nosotros to the aerosols maraca y hiss, al punk en español's furious sweat. Hang your head out the window y dale un grito tan lleno de duende that it cracks the pavement, summons our dead to dinner. Turn the tonal kaleidoscope, then pause, catch your breath so you don't miss the illegible moment where all the mystery lives. There, decipher that. Next, I'll read a poem that is part of an ekphrastic series in conversation with Mexican artist Eric Ricardo de Luna Genal's drawings for his Loteria project titled Cien Nombres para la Muerte, or 100 Names for Death. La Loteria, for any of you who are not familiar, is a Mexican game of chance that is similar to bingo, except that in Loteria, the player's cards contain squares with very simple drawings in them of objects or types of people and the names for them beneath the drawings. So one square on a card might contain a drawing of a tree and the word árbol beneath it. When the tree is called, you cover it with your card, just as you would the numbers in bingo. Many artists have created their own renditions of the Loteria game, Eric de Luna Genal being one of them. And so this is from a series of poems called Cien Nombres para la Muerte. And this is Las Jodidas, the screwed ones, after the prince La Jodida, Las Huesos, and La Carcona. We are bent from the loads we've carried, strapped to our bony backs, sacks of maíz, hierbas, frijoles, bundles of firewood, jerry jugs of precious agua. Each Saturday, we haul tall stacks of caged birds to the mercado to sell their captive songs, their laments our heaviest burden. Hobble a mile in our ragged huaraches, holes in their tire tread soles. Follow us to the village of whispers where the only gritos belong to the wind, empty doorways grown over with weeds, our men's dusty boots waiting years for their return. Look into the cenotes of our eyes. You'll find no fish, no flores, no monedas, only sacrifices with their mouths full of mud and the dread of our itchy grins. Then tell us you would never risk wrapping your little lamb in a rebozo, grabbing your withered staff and heading north. Devil's son, scorpion, migra be damned. You'd fly for the birds whose latches you could not unlock. You'd fly so the only satchel your daughter hoists on her shoulders is heavy with libros, lápices, y sueños. You'd fly, never believing they would wrest her from your back and lock her in a cage. And of course, that speaks to what we have seen happening at the border. And I'm just going to continue with a few more poems to finish my talk. The next poem is called Top 15 Reasons Mexicans Love Tortillas, and it's after Natalie Diaz's Top 10 Reasons Indians Are Good at Basketball. Because they are, whoops, sorry, lost my place. Because they are a meal as old as time itself. Because they are the spoon and fork rolled up in one. Because we can wipe our mouths with them when we run out of napkins. Because slapping the masa from hand to hand reminds us of playing patty cake with our babies, now too grown up for our silly games. Because we toss the store-bought ones directly on the gas burner and flip them quickly as a spark with our fingertips. No pots or pans necessary. Because when they hit the fire, little air pockets in the masa puff up with hope like hills in the flat, endless desert, or bubblegum and balloons on our birthdays. Because they taste like the clouds of heaven the nuns tell us we will sleep on if we learn to form our T's between our teeth with a sharp bite, if we wait until we are married to touch anyone's body or even our own below the neck. because pools of butter melt in their valleys and run down our chins as we clutch them in one hand while we shoot hoops in the other, because our mothers and grandmothers spend the whole day piling them in columns on their red Formica tabletops, because our fathers tell us how they hated making tortilla deliveries from their coaster wagons when they were boys, and abuela sold the delicacies to neighbors for a quarter per dozen. Because like one year to the next, they are circles. Because our eyes feast on golden wheat fields and our stories speak of yellow, blue, burgundy, brown, black kernels spilling from baskets before the corporate almighty outlawed all but one variety. Because cornrows are not only in our hair, but in our backyards. Because our bisabuela dried the kernels, soaked them in lime and water, ground them in molcajetes bigger than our heads, worked the dough until small round cakes lay in their hands, because they started from scratch. And next, I'm going to read a poem titled Carne y Hueso, Flesh and Bone. Brothers don't fight, he warns through clenched teeth as he drags his sons to the kitchen pantry, orders them to strip off their sweaty t-shirts and salts their naked backs. Lámenlo, he tells them, lick the grains off each other's skin. He watches, arms folded across his chest, as they take turns until their throats sting and their thick tongues have brushed each other's sticky espaldas clean. He never recounts his own brothers, how Emerio sank to the blood-spattered planks of a cantina, bullets pumping into his chest like the drills he'd driven into Veracruz oil fields for pesos, while thick pools bubbled around the knee-high boots of the rich. How Jesus fell in La Plaza, head smashed against a fountain as he sipped its arc of water, a neighbor's envious knife wedged between a woman's kisses, one on each shoulder blade. Or how Julio, the only living brother, fled Mazamitla's fields for Milwaukee's tanneries. How in the late hours of a double shift, he slid into a chemical spill, acids gnawing at flesh, fusing the St. Christopher medal around his neck to collarbone. No se pelean los hermanos, this father insists, those he lost stung back to life through the pores on his son's curved spines. And I have just a few more poems. This is called An Arm and a Leg. A bright red organic tomato without any bruises will cost you a fingernail, the longest one you have. A carton of raspberries, the pinky, up to its knuckle. Oh, you want to grow your own garden? That requires seeds and soil, which brings half a hand these days. No, we cannot throw in a trowel for free, hand over your thumb. If you injure your back bending to weed and wish to see a nurse, we are talking left hand and right foot. The doctor? Oh no, you don't have enough appendages for that. We've been told that last week you were in the market for clean air and the freedom to breathe it. That will cost you an arm. To breathe while black or brown, an arm and a leg. Some merchants will also charge you your neck. Why would you even inquire about justice? You know we haven't sold that for centuries. Well, only to the wealthiest among you, the ones who have two heads, a tail, and horns to pay. A pocketful of fresh cherries picked from the tree? That's more like it. But hope you brought a hacksaw that can cut through bone. So there's a phenomenon quite familiar to first-generation college students, of which I'm one, and other poor and working class people, called imposter syndrome. And this is a poem about that. Imposter syndrome. Don't sit in the back of the room with your head down, or the prof will call on you for sure. And he'll do it when you look most like you don't know the answer. But don't sit right in front either, because he'll call on you when he gets tunnel vision right in the middle of your breasts. Don't wear short skirts or low-cut blouses or the faded jean jackets passed down from your uncle who delivered baked goods to the grocery stores and supplied the whole family with broken breadsticks and smashed cookies. Dress to look smart. tweed trousers, and round-rimmed glasses. Nod and say, when a classmate shows off his private K through 12 education. Learn a few key phrases and pretend you've read everything Derrida, Foucault, and Saussure ever wrote. Then pretend you understand it. Then pretend you understand them until a kind soul helps you unknot their twisted tongues and you realize you've been thinking their thoughts in plain speak for years. Don't ever let them know that the only books in your childhood home were fix-it manuals and one dictionary from the 1940s, that you grew up threading 2 immigrant languages into your English that you still mispronounce income pass. Don't brag that you barely graduated from public school where the biology teacher instructed you to copy pages out of the textbook and leave 30 blank spaces in place of words. This would be your exam. The school where one girl stabbed another in the stairwell right after you dashed breathlessly up it because you were late for class and stoned. You knew then how to act straight. You know how to act, girl. You're a natural. Keep your mouth shut at meetings. Sit your chin on your fist like Rodin's The Thinker, staring off into space. And for God's sake, never let them hear your truck driver mouth. Don't call them ass pipes or cabrones. No fucking this or pinche that. Pretend this is not how you talk at home. Pretend, girl, pretend. Okay, I'd like to end with a final poem that I wrote after a line by the poet Juan Felipe Herrera. And with the exception of a few conjunctions and prepositions, which I added, all of the language in the poem was taken from works by Mexican-American and Native American authors whose publications were removed from Tucson public school classrooms when the Tucson United School District banned the district's Mexican-American Studies program under the 2010 law HB 2281. In 2017, a federal judge declared the law unconstitutional and enacted with discriminatory intent. The vast majority of the poem's phrases and lines were originally written by Juan Felipe Herrera, Sandra Cisneros, Caridad Civich, Luis Alberto Urrea, Gloria Ansaldúa, Lorna de Cervantes, Bernice Zamora, Diane Rodriguez, Luis J. Rodriguez, Evangelina Vigil Piñón, Sherry Moraga, Tomás Rivera, Elaulia Perez, Culture Clash, Gina Valdez, Tino Villanueva, Joy Harjo, and Sylvia Chacon. This poem is for them and for the young people who chained themselves to school board members' desks in protest of HB 2281. Because we come from everything. Because we come from everything, from zero, from a doubt slender as a hair, from a land of travelers, wanderers, and its geography of scars, from frayed edges and muddy hems, from the border sealed tight as an envelope, Meskin Dixon line. Because we come from Operation Wetback, Operation Peter Pan, Operation Gatekeeper, floodlights, sensors, infrared spy videos, night vision cameras, topo maps, helicopters, and holding cells, from shooting goose steppers around every corner, from alien gods and alien names and alien eyes and wild alien tongues, from the barbed wire politics of stupidity. Because we come from the ship that will never dock, from a parallel universe, double helix, synchronized psi, the infinite division del secreto terrible, the screaming sun. Because we come from steel mill smoke and silt slaughtering the sky, a matchbox house beneath the shadow of the freeway, windows so small you'd think they were holding their breath, and roaches so big they look Pleistocene, kids hopscotching on the sidewalk and a dusty, unpaved road called Sal Si Puedes. Because we come from the geometry of disaster, schools torn down and sold for scrap, bristled restrictions and Chuco hieroglyphics, the gash sewn back into a snarl, crushed cigarette in a glass. Because we come from linoleum and formica, from rooms boarded shut and rented to strangers in una esquina aparte de los demás, hole in the ceiling, kids on milk crates, the hammerhead of responsibility, tin plate face down on the floor. We come from brujas, chavalas, carnales, cabrones, rucas, locas, comadres, los vatos, los perros, y los perdidos. Una vieja y sus recuerdos, eternal ciphers with voices bright as chrome, because we come from every cell, every follicle, every nerve, the petals of the body, an orchid of blood, mapped birthmarks, knowing and unknowing. Because we come from museums and waiting rooms, hostile territory and collateral damage, because we come from the out of service area, from another bad dream, a bowl of beans, because we come from El Rascuache, Tex-Mex with a Brooklyn accent, Santeria Tupperware party, magnet car statuettes and kitsch calendar art at the flea market, La Segunda, from the word cachivaches and La Loteria, a world loaded on each back. Because we come from everything on top of everything, from unbending dreams and a long line of eloquent illiterates, the throat that must clear itself and apologize each time it speaks, a sound like swallowing mud. Because we come from El Camino de la Mestiza, the path of red and black ink, from linguistic terrorism and literary archaeologists from each of the star stories, because we come from a green flutter, the hummingbird's throat, a chorus resounding for acres, because we come from dichos, cantos, cuentos, from the spoken word, the seed of love in the darkness. Gracias and thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda, for that amazing reading and for your talk. And I am really glad that you read that last poem, because I think that that really touches on lineages and, you know, just thinking about where we're drawing our knowledges from. And I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about those lineages and you know, all those writers that you drew in
Mhm.
and listed in the poem. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, how you found your way as a writer, you know,
Mhm.
to them?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, when I was coming up, because I'm old, you know, when I was in high school, there was no Latinx literature in the curriculum. And there was few writers of color at all. But we did read Gwendolyn Brooks and we did read Langston Hughes. And for me, that was a huge spark, right? That also, what Walt Whitman, um, and uh, Thoreau and Dickinson, right? But especially reading Langston Hughes and Gwendolyn Brooks, they wrote in a language that felt more familiar to me, and that was what started the spark, right? That got me writing. I mean, I was writing even before that. I was writing when I was a child. They weren't necessarily poems; they were little stories, and I would sit in the back of a closet with a flashlight on top of my mother's shoes and sort of frantically write these little stories because I didn't want my brothers to see me because they would just tease me and tell me to get outside and play basketball. But yeah, I think that really was the sort of beginning spark. And I didn't really read, I read Latin American writers. I began to read writers in Spanish, when I was in undergraduate school because I was majoring in English and Spanish and history. And so I was reading Lorca, for example, Federico Garcia Lorca, and some of the other Latin American writers, and Pablo Neruda, right? Cortázar and Julio Cortázar, and multiple, I could go on and on. And so that was inspirational, but I still didn't find any really Latinx writers until more toward the end of my undergraduate education. And that was simply through Woodland Pattern Book Center, which is this gem of an organization. It's a not-for-profit bookstore, and it's also a literary and arts center in Milwaukee. that brings, has brought in, it's like been alive for over 30 years, I think 35 years now, and it's brought writers from all over the world, probably thousands of writers through, and artists. And it was there that they started to invite some Chicanx writers up from Chicago. And that was when I was, that was when I finally encountered writers like, at that time it was Carlos Compián, Raul Nino, but then through them, I got to know them because they asked me to read on a bill with Raul Nino, and they printed a little pamphlet, and it had a poem I had written, that was called Letter to an Ancestor, that was about the fact that my grandfather was like third cousins twice removed from Lázaro Cárdenas, who was once the president of Mexico. And he was known for nationalizing, the oil industry and giving water rights back to the indigenous people, right? So the United States hated him because they thought of him as like a communist. And I'd written that poem, and Carlos Compián called me up and said, are you really related to Lázaro Cárdenas? And I said, yeah, but I never knew him personally. This was like third cousins or something to my grandfather. And from that, I started to get to know about all the other writers. So like Lorena de Cervantes, I mentioned, there's language from her in there. Sandra Cisneros, who probably all of you know because she's been, gotten quite famous with her novels and short stories. Juan Felipe Herrera, who was our United States Poet Laureate before Joy Harjo. So many of those writers really opened the gates for me. I mean, to see that, wow, people are writing about backgrounds similar to my own and different from my own, because a lot of them were in the Southwest. And so it was a whole different, I mean, here we were, these weird, to them, like oddball Midwestern Chicanos, like, where does that come from? Right? So, you guys have snow, right? But anyway, it was just, and to see like writers like Alurista, who was way back, in the 70s, mixing Spanish and English and Mesoamerican indigenous languages in his work. And oh my God, I can do that. That was phenomenal. I don't know if I would have continued writing if I had never found those forebears, and I read them and just gobbled them up. And still today continue to do so, along with reading many writers of many backgrounds. But I don't, does that answer?
Yeah, that was great.
In a long form.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by, how writers find other writers, because I had a similar experience, I think, just in terms of my education, not being introduced to a lot of writers of color, even women writers. I think we read one, no international writers, no indigenous writers. So it's definitely something that I think a lot about as an educator. And I think, and I think it's surprising to me still how non-inclusive curriculum is. So I want to call next on Amber, who has a question.
Hi, Brenda. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. After reading Placa Roll Call and learning a little bit more about your roots with the labor movement and union organizing, I'm wondering what role does the audience play when writing your poetry, and how do you consider your audience when starting a new piece of writing?
Okay, so the audience. Well, I think in some of my work, I probably to some extent limit my audience. The work that's very interlingual, right? Like Placa Roll Call is one of those poems where one sort of has to be bilingual, right? To understand everything, right? Of course, you can look it up, though. It's not like, I mean, a monolingual Spanish speaker can look up the English, a monolingual English speaker can look up the Spanish, and we have those tools right at our fingertips now with computers. And I would hope that people who are interested would, or that people would just listen to, right, the language, whatever language it is that they don't understand, and sort of just listen to the rhythms and the music of that language. Because I don't think poetry is only about meaning, right? The meanings we've attributed to words, but it's about sound, it's about music, it's about, I kind of tell audiences, if you don't understand parts of the poem, just dance to it. And I think that, a lot of it you'll get from context, right? But so I do write a lot all in English too. And you just heard me read poems that were written completely in English. I've written poems completely in Spanish. But so I try to, so that like in the course of a book or collection, right, there will be something kind of for all of those audiences, right? Monolingual English, monolingual Spanish, bilingual folks. But that's not all there is to audience. So I guess I want to write in a way that many people can access the poem, right? I want to write in a way that, everybody's going to get their own interpretation of it. Everybody's going to read it in their own way, and as well they should. But I want to write in a way that doesn't lose the complexities of what I'm writing about. And that doesn't in any way, I'm not saying doesn't like dummy down anything, but that's language is somewhat accessible, right? To people who aren't just other poets. Because so often as poets, we're just writing to other poets, right? And who goes to the poetry readings? Other poets. And so I'd like to be able to inspire somebody else to write. The way that the writers I just mentioned in my answer to Ching-Yi's question inspired me to write. And so that somebody might not be somebody who's already college educated. That might not be somebody who's thought of themselves as an English major, or who's read a ton. But I think that, once they start writing, they'll start reading more. So I think that's important to me too. There's probably more, but I don't want to blabber too long. Does that help?
Definitely. It's one of the things I noticed is how accessible. I'm not a poet. My background's like more journalism-based writing, and I love poetry, but I'm not trained in it. And I just, reading it, I was able to absorb it in a way that, even though I didn't understand every single word, and it was really great to see Spanish, but it was more than that. There was something that was really accessible to me, and I was wondering about the audience. So thank you.
Yeah, good, great. I'm happy. That's exactly, I want to be able to reach you, right? Somebody who says, I'm not a poet, yeah.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I'm gonna call on Sam next to ask a question.
Hi, Ms. Brenda. My honor to listen to you today. Well, at least have one person inspired, but I'm sure you've inspired the whole class about writing interlingually. Some of us do have other languages, and so I'd like to ask if you can give us a little bit more of a background, perhaps, like how you and maybe other writers that you know of started and then navigated your interlingual projects and poems. Because even in resisting the reification of English and encouraging the multiplicity of like interlingual constructions, other colonial languages like the European Spanish or French continue to dominate, and they exert their grammatical dominance, if not supremacy. I understand that in trying to make it accessible, we still have to have that scaffolding. But I wanted to hear a story about how you work through that, and maybe also how you see other writers working through that, because that's going to be a writer's struggle for each of us as well, right?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it comes from just that's what I heard. That's the language I heard, right, as a child growing up, right? And not only as a child, like I said, in many of the communities I lived in, when I lived in Pilsen, that was how a lot of folks talked, and so it's natural to me, like you switch codes grammatically in a sentence in certain places. It isn't just arbitrary, right? It isn't like we just throw the language up in the air and wherever it falls, it's not arbitrary at all. In fact, this is an old book, but there's a book by Rosaura Sanchez called Chicano Discourse. She's a linguist, and this book is like from the 80s, but she argues that in the book that Spanglish or Inglañol, right, or Calo, which was the language, a sort of special kind of Spanish mixed with English that the Pachucos used in the 40s and 50s. She says that these are languages, that they're not they're not just dialects, or that they're not just slang, that they're actually languages, because there are particular places in a sentence, syntactically and grammatically, where one will switch codes. So, I mean, I definitely, when I do that, I'm doing that, right? Which is partly natural. But because I'm a poet, I'm also thinking about sound, and always thinking about sound. So I also, when I combine the languages, I'm thinking about where can I get like an interlingual rhyme, right? Or interlingual alliteration, or interlingual, right, assonance, or whatever it is, so that I'm trying to do more than I would just do in a conversation, where I'd move back and forth between the languages, but to play, it makes it more playful, right? That you have this English word rhyming with the Spanish word, and then maybe at times I even do draw on a few words from Nahuatl, which is the language of the Aztec people, or from Purépecha, which is the language, the Purépecha people were also called Tarascan, and as another, indigenous group in Mexico. But those languages aren't my languages, right? My Purépecha, my grandfather knew some of it, but they're not my languages. So I'm careful how much I do that, but I sometimes use them because they're still part of who we are, right? And so often the indigenous gets erased, So and how do I negotiate how much I want to give to the reader who doesn't understand the Spanish in the poems? I think that I don't want any reader to like sort of miss the whole point of the poem, right? So I'm going to contextualize that Spanish phrase will be surrounded by English that will give them enough context that sometimes they'll get it even not realizing they get it, right? But at the same time, there are times when, this is going to sound bad, but there are times when I just don't care. I have a phone ringing. I'm so sorry. There's nobody here to turn it off. 1 second. Give me 1 second. It was an alarm ringing that I didn't realize was going to go off. I apologize. Sometimes it's like my audience is that bilingual audience. And, that's who I really want to reach with that. And if other people can't read that poem, then they can't read that poem. There's other poems that I'll write for them, that maybe the audience for each poem is maybe different, right? And so I don't mean that in a dismissive way, but sometimes I'm just writing for mi gente, right? And I think that's okay. I don't know if that answers it or not. Tell me if it doesn't. Are you looking for something more specific, or?
If I may just share and reflect what I heard from you. The poem addresses the reader. The poem will call the reader to read it. So it's not the writer who's writing the poem. We're just the vessel for the poem.
Yeah.
And the relationship between the poem and the reader, that's entirely up to, after having written it, it's entirely up to the reader whether they pay attention to it or not.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I've had people, you know, I'm sure, are you a poet? Or a writer?
I try, but I don't know it.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you've ever experienced it, but I have, where I've had people, other people interpret my poems in front of me, discuss them and say what they think they mean without having heard me say anything about it. And I'm often just amazed at some of the interpretations they come up with, because they weren't necessarily, I wasn't necessarily intending those meanings consciously. But when I hear them speak about it, I'm like, yeah, I can see how that's it. I can see how someone could read that in there. I can see how that's possible. And I can see how that would have been in my subconscious, right? Because some of what we do, we're not necessarily doing consciously as writers. Thank you.
Thanks, Brenda. I'm gonna call on Olivia.
Hi, Brenda. Thank you so much
Olivia.
for being here today. I resonated with your poetry. I also am the grandkid of Mexican and German immigrants, so I resonate with that part of your identity too.
You're another rancherita. I call us rancheritas, right? Because
I less couthly, my sister and I call ourselves Beaner Schnitzels, but that's a little less. My question was just about how you reflect and think about your work, so specifically how it's changed over time, and how your understanding of your work has changed over time.
Well, that's interesting. You know, I almost feel like there's been this weird kind of circle thing that's happened. Obviously, our work always changes because we're influenced by by everybody we're reading. And one thing that has always been true for me is that often my reading is way far ahead of my writing. So the people that I'm reading and I'm interested in what they're doing, I can't quite do that yet, right? So my reading is always way far ahead. I'm reading people that I'm holding way up here, and sometimes I'll never do what those writers do because it wouldn't be natural to me, right? It would feel forced. It would be like I was trying to be somebody else, right? And other times I do learn from them, and the writing changes, right? So I think that you know, I've been really influenced in the years since I began teaching at the university, right? And teaching doctoral students who are brilliant, like your professor. And also I married a poet whose style of writing is really different from mine, right? Who writes, I don't even know how to describe, his poems feel like chants, they feel like meditations. They have amazing images, but they're very dense. You know, you got to read them over and over again to understand them, right? They're very experimental, right? And he opened up whole worlds of literature that I hadn't been paying attention to me. I did the same for him though, because there were a lot of, he's Latinx too, he's Panamanian. And there were a lot of US Latinx writers that he hadn't read at all. And so we traded in a way, right? And so I think that the writing I was doing before meeting him, which was right around the time when I also started teaching at the university and having all these incredibly brilliant students, right? I started to experiment with more things in many different ways, right? And so the stuff I read tonight was pretty accessible, but I have other pieces I've written that are, you know, a lot more experimental and that are going to require a lot more participation. The reader is going to have to work a lot harder at it, you know, and so my work is all over the board that way. And yet at the same time, it didn't feel real and honest to say, well, I'm going to now write like my husband because I admire what he does, because that isn't like just what came from me, right? So I feel in some ways like my writing has gone full circle in the sense that I feel like right now I'm writing something that feels really genuinely like it's me, like it's coming from me, it's coming from my voice. I don't know, that's kind of not a great answer, but I mean, like narrative has always been important to me. You know, I tell a lot of stories in poems. That doesn't, and you can experiment with the narrative, right? And how that story is told. And I think for a long time, I was trying to move away from narrative because my mind was thinking it was passé, right? And I should be doing something more with it, right? More now. And instead of thinking like that, now I'm just like, well, what can I do with the narrative? So I would
Thank
say
you
that.
so much. Thank
Yeah.
you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Brenda. I'm going to call on Hannah next.
Hi, I want to echo the thanks that everyone has also been sharing. It's been really incredible to hear from you.
Oh, thank you, Hannah.
I'm going to follow the people who've been asking about language, and I apologize if this question doesn't come out in a way that makes sense. I'm going to do my best. So I have a little bit of a background in translation, and I'm interested in the multilingual nature of the poems as being largely localized to a specific context. Like, as you've mentioned, you're addressing a particular audience, and or maybe not, or in some ways. So I guess I was wondering, what are your thoughts on translation in general, like not just between the two languages used in the poem, but attempting to represent it in another language? Do you think that there are poems that would be maybe more difficult to translate because of those two languages, or would that difficulty make them more relevant in their specific contexts? Do you not like having someone else? Sorry, this isn't making sense, but just what are your thoughts on translation in general?
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, translation is complicated because, right, you can never really translate, right? That's the thing, like it's an impossibility, and yet we need it. I feel that we need it because I think that in the United States, we can be very provincial and sort of, you know, claustrophobic, right? Where we're only reading writers who are from the English speaking world writing in English. And that's really problematic because in so many other countries, readers are reading works that were written originally in many languages. And you know, here we are in the United. And so I think we need more translators translating this literature so that, you know, more readers can read it, literature from all over the world. And yet it's complicated because you can't, it's like representation. Can you really ever represent anything in art? You know, I mean, you can draw it, but it's not really it, you know, and it's only capturing it in that one particular moment. And translation is the same way because language is part of culture and it has all these cultural contexts, and the words have so many different meanings. Like, which meaning are you going to choose? And then are you going to translate for the sound, or are you going to translate for the sense, right? That's the toughest one, right? Yeah. And, you know, there are translators who translate more for sound than for sense. And so the poems, the translation might mean very differently, right, to the same reader than the original would. And then there are translators that are really purists, like, no, it's all got to be about meaning, getting the meaning, right? I think there's a happy medium, right, in between there, where because if the poem is written in that particular language in a certain meter and rhyme scheme, and you don't capture any of that, you completely lose that musicality. You're really losing a big part of the poem, especially because, you know, the form of the poem enhances the meaning, often carries a lot of the meaning. You know, we write something in a certain rhythm to underscore something that's happening, right, in the line. And so it's tough translation. There's all kinds of translation theory out there. I haven't read a lot of it. You know, maybe you have. I would like to before I do any kind of major translation project. But, you know, yeah, those are some ideas, some thoughts that I have, is negotiating that what are you translating for, right? And how are you going to find that happy medium? And what are you going to do with the words that there is no translation for? I say just leave them in the original language, right? Just leave some of those words in the original and read great translators. Like, I was just thinking about I'm trying to remember who it was who translated Juan Rulfo's book. Juan Rulfo, who wrote Pedro Páramo, which is one of my favorite novels. It's a Mexican novel written in Spanish. And there's a translator, I believe her last name is Peden, who did just a brilliant translation of it. And I've seen other translations, right? And they're not as good. Or you can look, a lot of people have translated Cesar Vallejo. And if you look at one translator compared to the next, you can really see a difference. So I would just try to do that to develop your own skills. Mm-hmm.
Could I ask just in follow-up? Sorry, I was just so particularly struck by the nature of some of your poems, like Placa Roll Call, is that if you are monolingual in one of those languages, you have to reach particularly hard to find the other language. And it seems like that sort of poem is meant for a very specific context, and that translating something like that would be so difficult because you wouldn't be able to really represent that context of the multilingual nature of it. And I don't know. So
yeah, that one would, those kind of translingual poems or interlingual poems would be really hard to translate. Yeah. What are you going to do the Spanish and English and the English? No, you can't. And also that particular poem has a lot of slang Spanish in it too. It's not only the Spanish you're going to find in the dictionaries, right? So that makes it, yeah, exactly.
the linguistic nature is so tied to the subject of the poem. Okay, I will stop talking now, but
yeah. No, you're right. But I'm glad you're translating. Keep translating. Yeah, keep doing it.
Thanks, Brenda. Call on Kara next.
Hi, Chingy. Hi, Brenda. Hi,
Hey.
Brenda Cárdenas.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Kara, hi.
Good to
You look so different. Hi.
Yes, I do. It's been such a long time since I've seen you.
Wow.
But thank you, Chingy, for inviting me to this, because it's really just made my terrible end of the semester week to be able to see you speak from afar. And I wanted to ask you a question as well, because I was really moved listening to you talk tonight about how deeply entwined, to me, it sounds like, your teaching practices have been with community or communities, right? And I was really curious if you might be able to speak just a little bit about how some of those experiences perhaps have changed your practices in teaching, in the teaching of writing, and how you think about working with students on text, especially when sometimes you're teaching students whose contexts may be very different from the writers of the text that you are bringing to them into the classroom space.
Well, I think, you know, obviously, I think those experiences have made me much more sensitive to students of all different backgrounds, right? And including students who, like, you know, like me, are first generation college students. I'm much more sensitive to that. And so I think that I really try to embrace their various languages. I always tell students that we're all multilingual, right? Like if you, because there's so many registers of language, and that language isn't, you know, that it isn't that one register is right and another register is wrong, or, you know, the grammatical whatever error. It's that these are all different registers, and you use them in different, you know, context, different spaces, different times. And the more you can master the different registers, just the more fluid that you're going to be, right? And being able to bounce around, right, to different settings. And so, but I very much value the languages that are really their true languages, you know, what they're brought up with, and I don't seek to correct their right to make them write a standard American English, you know. Although I get that to some degree, we have to make that available to them for their, you know, so they can, if they want to go to graduate school or whatever, they have to be able to write this essay, you know. But when we're talking about, especially when we're talking about creative writing, no, I want to value those registers that they're working in, that they're writing in. And let's see, I think also the practices I have, the things I've done with community have really made me also a teacher that wants to sort of explode or tear down like borders between genres, borders between art forms. Like I often teach, I do a lot of teaching of, you know, the visual and the verbal together. A lot of texts that I teach are, you know, I'm not just talking about ekphrastic work responding to art, but work that is the visual and the verbal on the page together. So I'm thinking of, you know, if you go back to the Phillips, the Humulent, and much more recent books that have been written, like Anthony Cody's got this awesome book called Borderland Apocrypha, or Doug Kearney's work, right, with all the visual stuff on the page. And so I think like tearing down sort of those borders between art forms and between languages and between, you know, yeah, exactly. I think that's a big part of my pedagogy right there. I don't know if you're looking like for specific examples.
Not necessarily.
I like to have students, for example, like just an example of tearing those things down, and to do journals where they draw on them and they paint in them and they paste things in them and they collage in them and they write in them. They don't only write in them, you know, that these are all forms of expression, and that's sort of the collage they make on a page one day that might lead to writing a piece, right? So that's a little example. And, you know, having them do projects. I've had students have a choice sometimes in a class between writing a poem in response to art, or making a visual art piece in response to a poem, right? They don't always have to write. They can, sometimes they can draw, right? Or I do have them do a lot of collaborative work with each other. And I try to do things like, I teach Latinx literature too. And in that course, I always have my students write a linguistic autobiography. And it doesn't, I mean, it's not because they're like Latinx students in the class. There might only be 3 or 4 and the other 25 are not, right? But again, they still can, they still can go back to, right, that particular jargon that they have to speak at work, or, and so I have them look at, right, their lives in terms of language, and how the different languages and registers of language they've learned, and how it's changed over time. And, yeah. So I'm sorry that I'm kind of blabber. I mean, this was the kind of question that I would write an essay on. And I would think very thoughtfully about how I was going to answer it. But, I think it's also like building community in the classroom. I mean, these other contexts in which I've been an active, worked as an activist, as a cultural worker, right? It's all been about community. It's all been about community, right? And so it's all, that means safe space. That means a safe space where everybody feels honored, everybody feels respected. That means working with each other to help each other develop each other's own voices, as instead of trying to make somebody into you, right? Like, I would never want to make a bunch of little Brendas running around like that. Would be awful, right? And I would not want my students to critique each other's work with that, trying to make the poem they would write. No, how can you help your compadre over there, your fellow student, your compatriot, right? How can you help that person write what they're writing, how they want to write it in the best that it can be? Yeah. I hope that
Thank
helped.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that assignment. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you, Brenda. My students might be laughing because I just made them write about their worst job, and then I asked them to come up with 20 words that are specific to the job, like lingo and jargon.
Yeah. I mean, we bounce around. People aren't conscious of how much they bounce around in language, how these are different languages or registers of language. But, we move. I mean, if people in the academic world heard how I speak sometimes at home, right? The way I was raised, the things I heard, my mother called everybody an ass pipe, right? My mother, in fact, said, this is talk about working class. I remember one time I was about 14 years old, and I wanted Levi's because that's what was popular then. And it had to be the red tag Levi's, right? And I took her, she said, okay, show me what it is you want. I took her to the store and I showed her. She took one look at the price tag and she said, okay, she dragged me to Kmart. She handed me the plain pockets and she said, here, we're buying these and I'll paint the red tag on your ass. That was how I grew up. Oh.
So I have a question from Frisia, also from Milwaukee.
Frisia McKee?
Yeah, I think Frisia wanted me to ask the question because of a funky mic situation. So the question is, what is it like to teach in academia in the city you grew up in?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? I mean, it feels like I'm at home. I mean, to me, I like it. I really enjoy teaching in the city that I grew up in because I have a sense of, although it's changed, the city has changed a lot since the time I grew up, but I have a sense of where my students are coming from. The undergrads, I mean, my graduate students come from all over the country, right? But undergrads, a lot of our undergrads, Milwaukee is a commuter school. You know, it's not the kind of school where most students live in campus housing or dorms, right? There are dorms, but very few students live in them. It's an urban school where students, you know, take the bus or drive or whatever into campus every day. And I know the city, you know, I know all different neighborhoods in the city. And so I might not know every single area my students come from. Like I'm not so great with the suburbs, but I even know some of those, right? And so I have a sense of, you know, where they grew up, and I like that about it. Yeah, I mean, I don't live like right by campus because I need that separation. So that's why I live on the south side, and, you know, campus is the east side. It's nice to have that separation. You leave so that you're not always, you know, carrying it with you. But I think it's pretty great. I mean, for a long time, I felt like it was a failure thing that I had moved away from Milwaukee and lived in Michigan and then lived in Chicago, always stuck in the damn Midwest, right? But that, and then ended up coming back to Milwaukee, almost like to come back to home was some kind of failure somehow, especially because it was Milwaukee and who wants to come here? And it has these, you know, horrible winters, but I don't feel that way anymore. I feel like it enhances my ability to connect with students.
Thank you, Brenda. I think we're coming to the end of our questions tonight. So, I mean, if you did want to ask Brenda a question, you know, this is kind of your last opportunity to message Simon. I also, so just to give a little bit more time in case folks do want to ask questions, I wanted to let you know about our, we have some upcoming talks for the labor colloquium, which I think Simon put in the chat, and they're upcoming Thursdays, and so please join us. You can hit the link and you can register for those. And we also have, we're doing a speculative storytelling session in the last part of the class. And we are inviting 14 community members to join 3 synchronous speculative storytelling sessions. And we're going to be reimagining work, labor, educational pathways, and alternative and solidarity economies. So there's information there. And Simon, I'll ask you if you could put the link also to the Google form. So if folks are interested, you can sign up there, and we'll get back to you by May 10th about participation. So, and I'm gonna, so next week's,
Sorry about the barking.
oh, no worry. I just got a dog, so she's very quiet because she hates Zoom calls, but sometimes she comes in here and she barks. I'm gonna ask Charu, my colleague, to ask a question, and Charu is also going to be next week organizing the roundtable on social reproduction reimagined. So I encourage folks to sign up if you're interested.
That's
Thanks, Chingy.
wonderful that you're bringing community members in. That's great.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I am a member of this community. I'm not a creative writer or poet, but this is actually a question both for Brenda, for you. I really love this talk, and for the students. Because part of what I'm curious about, because of the way you as writers and you as students navigate these questions of genre, text, and culture, and in relation to the talk I heard last week, which was about the need for a sort of deep investment and history in genre, and so on as part of learning to write. What is your thought about reader effort? Because reader effort is a concept that's also about student effort in many ways, because students are readers, students are interlocutors. And I say this as someone who has to do a lot of reader effort when I come into these spaces. I'm an economist by training. But at the same time, when I see my genre, when I look at economics, it's mysterious to a lot of people. But to me, data is like a painting. You know, graphs, they're like videos. They tell stories the way in which comics book do. And you know, I've been really struck by how creative writers can ask of their audiences investment that I somehow never can. So I want to really ask you and the students, what is the balance you have between accessibility and realizing that there's a point at which accessibility is like, and it's not just, by the way, for data, it's like when I teach South Asian studies, most of my students imagine they need to read 2 and only 2 South Asian women. One is called Gayatri Spivak, the other is called Chandra Mohanty. They are wonderful people. They were my mentors, but we actually have written a lot more since the 1980s. We didn't stop. It's like everybody who's read 3 Black feminists, and that's the end of it. And the number of people who, you know, I loved your work, and I loved how it spoke to a rich history of people like Gloria Anzaldúa, Sherry Moraga, but there's large numbers of people who feel they read those 2. They are done. You know, so how do you navigate that moment when you tell students, I'm really glad you read 2, you might need to read 5. You might need to think through what else is going on and make some effort to go past. This is, I think, a real question of cultural competencies that you as a writer have to ask about. So, and for students, what do you all do about what's asked of you in these moments? That was the question.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I think you're so right about that. I mean, well, one thing I think I do is I am so enthusiastic about, there are so many more, you know, writers than, like you say, Moraga and Anzaldúa. I'm so enthusiastic about what's out there that I partly just spread that enthusiasm by, you know, by osmosis. Does that mean every student is going to read all that? No, I mean, especially in, like, when I do a Latinx literature class, that might be the only Latinx literature they ever read, right? And so I really make them read. I mean, I assign a lot of reading in my classes, and do all of them read every single thing that's on the syllabus? No, but some do. And some, you know, want to read more, and some ask me for reading lists, and, you know, and so I assign a lot of reading. I'm very conscious of my reading lists, my requirements being incredibly diverse. And that would be even within a Latinx literature class, right? Because we're talking about just that title is so ridiculous, right? Because we're talking about, you know, Cuban Americans and Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans and, you know, Guatemalan Americans and Salvador. And we're talking about, and can we read a text by every single one? No, but we can make that as diverse as possible, right? Which means it's an awful lot of work on our part, a lot of responsibility, because then we have to teach those books within their historical and their cultural context. So, you know, I find myself having, you know, to teach Cristina Garcia's Dreaming in Cuban, I'm having to teach all about Castro and the, the whole, you know, and the entire, right, Cuban, you know, revolution. And so, and yet it's so important to be able to really access those works. And I think it's partly modeling too, being a reader who reads. I read very widely. You know, I mean, I've talked a lot about other Latinx writers tonight, but I also read many, many Native American writers. I read many Asian American writers. I read many Anglo-American writers. I read many in Africa. I read a lot. I read as widely as I possibly can. And that includes all different aesthetics, not just different you know, cultural, racial, right, socioeconomic backgrounds, but all different aesthetics. And so I can appreciate the most experimental language poem, and then I can appreciate like a very traditional sonnet for what they are. And I think that, you know, I think modeling that is helpful too, to students to see, wow, in 1 minute she's talking about, you know, Jackson McLowe, right, who's real experimental poet, and the next minute she's talking about, you know, I don't know, Edna St. Vincent Millay sonnet, right? So I think that's, you know, that's part of it. So the question, how do we, what part of the question am I not getting to? Because you were saying, how do we get them? How do we inspire
Yeah,
them?
this was perfect. Yeah, because it is about getting reader effort, not just reader knowledge, but reader effort, which is a different thing. Right?
Which is a
So,
different, reader effort, like the effort you have to put into reading a text too.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That you have to look things up. Oh yeah. I always tell my students, I always say, you know, when they won't look up an allusion, right? So there'll be an allusion to mythology or an allusion to history or something. And then they'll look up an allusion. I'm like, come on, you've got Google. I have the library and sit in the stacks for hours trying to find right, like something that would, where I would be able to understand this allusion in Shakespeare or whatever, right? You guys have it right at your fingertips, so no excuses, you know. And they just laugh, of course, right? They just laugh at, you know, me talking about the days before computers, but yeah, you have to put, reading isn't just glossing over it as you're falling asleep. It requires participation. Actually, I think there's some poetry that I love because the reader is partly making the poem as they read it. The writer is writing the poem in such a way that they're inviting the reader to be part of creating the meaning, right, as they read the poem. And that's very demanding, but you know, you get an awful lot out of that as a reader.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. It's been such a gift to hear your work and your thoughts and your engagement. I was wondering if you had any final thoughts or anything, you know, you wanted to say to close out the evening.
Just to thank everybody for having such great questions, some of which I could have answered a lot better. But and thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. I know everybody is busy. I know everybody is sick of the screen, right? I mean, because everybody's doing everything in this format. And I think we've discovered some really wonderful things about these formats that we can use in the future. But I think we're all tired of the mediated space, and we really need that radical faciality. We need to see each other again, right? Face to face, you know. And so I really appreciate the attention that you've given me and your kindness, your kind words. And I hope I've left you with something that will resonate for you in the days to come. And thank you so much to Ching-Yi Chen, Dr. Chen. I don't know how you would prefer. Dr. Chen, she earned it. They earned it. Dr. Chen earned it, right? So a big thanks to Dr. Chen for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And you'll see, you know, a lot of love in the chat. Hope everyone has a good night and stay safe.